Hello. Thank you for joining us this evening for our celebration of Women's History Month with a special LexSeeHer Speaker Series event featuring author and historian Mary Keenan. My name is Helen Liu, and I am the Programming and Partnerships Manager at Cary Library. Before we begin, I want to take a moment to thank the Cary Library Foundation. Their support enables us to bring programs like tonight's event to you. I would also like to thank LexSeeHer and the Lexington Historical Society for their partnership on this program. We will have time for questions at the end of the program, and there are also copies of Mary's book available for purchase in the back of the room. Now I'd like to introduce our moderator. Jessie Steigerwald founded LexSeeHer in March 2020 and joyfully serves as the organization's president. Among Jessie's activities for LexSeeHer, she leads the research team and coordinates the annual 1769 spinning protest tableau. She is organizing the 2024 unveiling ceremony, the Living Herstory Project, and the coordinated First Look events, which will run throughout Lexington's celebration of the 250th anniversary of the Battle of Lexington. Jessie, welcome. I'll now pass the mic to you to host and introduce our guest this evening.
Thank you. Is that right? Okay. Oh, there. Hello. I'm Jessie, and I'm going to pretty quickly jump into our program. I will just tell you that one of the best things about LexSeeHer has been the chance to connect with other people who are very interested in history, all time periods, not just 1775, not that that's not wonderful, but also the chance especially to meet and work with Mary. Mary joined our advisory board from the start. She did not know me from a hole in the wall, but she cared about the topic. And we've become, I would venture to say, good friends. And the project has been so much more successful because Mary has been there at every step of the way as both a historian, an author, a strategic thinker, an educator. And I know some of you already know her, and if you do not, you will really enjoy this chance this evening. So Mary, I want us to dive in. Mary's going to speak, then I'm going to ask some questions, and then we will hopefully have a great dialogue as a community. Mary.
Okay, thank you, Jessie. Thank you, Helen, and thanks to Cary Library, and thank all of you for coming. I'm just overwhelmed to see fellow colleagues from the high school in Clark and former students. I mean, my goodness, I don't know where the years have flown. To introduce yourself as from Ava's team at Diamond. Oh, it just boggles my mind. But anyway, last week, LexSeeHer's lecture was Margaret Copey talking about the role of the League of Women Voters, and they presented a petition to the State House to decrease the number of legislators, senators, and representatives in Massachusetts. And so that was last week. That was 20th century. Tonight we're 19th century. And between 1843 and 1860, Lexington citizens sent 13 petitions to the Massachusetts General Court. Most of these were involved with slavery, including the first one, 1843, to save George Latimer, escaped enslaved person with his wife from Virginia. There were other petitions to abolish the fugitive slave law, to remove Judge Loring, who had approved the sending back of a fugitive slave to his master. And just to show you how this got everyone all riled up, that they petitioned the governor and the state legislature to remove Judge Loring. The governor didn't. He lost the subsequent election. The next governor, Governor Banks, did remove him, and then President Buchanan took pity on him and made him clerk of the courts in Washington, D.C. There were petitions to abolish capital punishment, to have better treatment for prisoners, for women's suffrage, and to repeal the personal liberty laws, which were a sticking point of keeping the Union together. Well, the right of petition, we all know, comes from the First Amendment: speech, press, assembly, religion, and petition, to petition the government for a redress of grievances. Now, women were used to petitions in those days, even though we may not think so. It was up to state legislatures to adjudicate divorces. And so there were petitions to the state legislatures for divorce. It was also women who wrote petitions to the Army for military pensions for their husband after the Revolutionary War. The world was just humming with petitions. There were 745,000 petitions between 1835 and 1837 in those two Congresses. And that's not the signers. The signers would be in the millions. So 745 petitions. The population then was about 13 million. You know, take Massachusetts, double it. About a sixth of the population were enslaved people, and so they would now have no power of petitioning. Anyway, well, Lexington petitions. The two women on the LexSeeHer Monument who signed petitions were Caroline Wellington and Julia Robbins. The Wellingtons, they go on forever, and they married everyone else in town, and everyone is related to a Wellington. First, there was the Benjamin Wellington, who had 10 children, which was about the normal number for folks in Lexington. So if you're a woman every 2 years, you could plan on being pregnant for another 9 months. Benjamin had 10 children. Among them were Benjamin and Peter. Benjamin married Polly Hastings. His brother Peter married Hepzibah Hastings. So you have brothers marrying sisters. And they all lived in this, those two couples lived and raised their children in the same house, which is now the Lexington Montessori School, without the additions. Benjamin had 7 sons and 4 daughters. Peter had 7 sons and 6 daughters. And so, anyway, it was the hotbed for petitioning, particularly for Peter's family. His son Andrew signed all 13 petitions. Peter signed only 12. He had a petition to promote the personal liberty law, and then he wouldn't sign to repeal it. But anyway, so you have Caroline Wellington, who is the daughter of Peter and Hepzibah. She and her sisters and brother signed many petitions. Caroline herself signed 4. Her sister Louisa, in 1879, when they founded the Lexington Women's Suffrage League, became president of that. A couple of the sisters worked on the board, a cousin worked on the board. It was a Wellington show. And the other family that you need to know about are the Robbins Simons family. You may remember the tale of Joshua Simons. On April 19th, he was at the meeting house to get powder for his musket, and he saw a British soldier approaching, and he was afraid the British soldier would scamper off with all their powder. So he lay his musket on top of the powder keg, threatening to blow it up if the soldier took it. Well, anyway, Joshua Simons had, I think, only 8 children, including a daughter, Martha, who married Rufus Merriam, who was the first postmaster, whose daughter, Julia Stetson, married Caleb Stetson, the famous preacher. But the important one in that family was the last born, Hannah. Hannah Simons married Eli Robbins. Eli Robbins was the son of Stephen Robbins, the fur mill manufacturer in East Lexington. When you drive through East Lexington today, it's hard to imagine. At one time, it was one of the most crowded, busiest manufacturing places in all of Massachusetts. There were about 100 people employed in Eli Robbins mills, and they made tippets, which is the piece of fur that lines the inside of your coat to keep the breezes out. They made boots, fur-lined shoes, hats, gloves, you name it. And Eli also experimented with a rubber-treated coat. So anyway, Eli married Hannah Simons, and then they had a family, mostly of girls. The firstborn, Hannah, had a hearing deficiency, and so never went to the private academy in Derry, New Hampshire, that her sisters, Abigail, Ellen, and Julia went to. And Adams Female Academy was one of the most advanced for females. Geometry, calculus, all sorts of things, not just fancy drawing. And they also had just started a course in French. Yale had just adopted French, and it was considered very risque. Well, anyway, so you have the Robbins Simons, and Hannah signed about 8 of the petitions. Her husband Eli signed several, and they not only had their daughters at their home, but they gave room to a friend of theirs who was blind and elderly, Andrew Davidson, who started a petition. And they particularly had their, it was George Washington Simons, Hannah's nephew, came to live with them. And he was a real go-getter of a kid and used to dash off petitions. And then he'd probably be the one who would cart them into Boston. And so you have Caroline Wellington and the Robbins, Julia Robbins, presented on the LexSeeHer Monument. Okay, woman's world in those days. It was very different from our world, without washing machines and dryers and dishwashers and things like that. If you were lucky, you went to a female academy, and the Robbins girls were lucky enough to go to a female academy. But death was a very frequent visitor to homes in Lexington. Young children didn't survive after a couple of days or weeks. Mothers often died in childbirth, so you would have husbands frequently, well, at least in several cases that I came across, the mother's sister, the single spinster aunt, would come and take care of the children. And then in a year or two, she would be the new Mrs. And that happened in several cases. Young children died at an alarming rate. Looking up all this in Hudson's genealogy, it was sad. Benjamin and Polly lost a son, Oliver Hastings, the first year that he was first year of life. And so their second child, they named Oliver Hastings, which was the common way to do it. You named the next child for a child who had deceased. Their son, Edward, drowned in Fresh Pond when he was a student at the Lawrence Scientific School, which is now Harvard Engineering. And you think, oh my gosh. Peter and Hepzibah had a son, Elbridge Gerry, who went off to California and died there. Samuel Hastings, Peter and Hepzibah's lived less than a year. And which brings me to the fact they were very, very historic in their interests. The names of children in Lexington, it's a wonder they were big enough to carry the name. You have Oliver Hastings Wellington, you have Jonas Clark Wellington. Just to give you a few, Waldo Emerson Lawrence, Harrison Gray Otis Monroe, William Harrison Brown, John Winfield Scott Kendall, Benjamin Franklin Locke, George Washington Locke, George Washington Simons, Jonas Clark Harrington, Lucy Stone Smith, Thomas Jefferson Winship, Isaac Newton Damon, and Patrick Henry Chandler. And so they really considered their history. Other deaths, Abigail Muzzy, age 2, drowned in a tub of water. An older child was murdered on the way home from California. He was carrying some money. He got off the plane in the train in Altoona, Pennsylvania, and was murdered. Anyway, some were lost at sea. There were accidental gun discharges. So the woman's world in those days wasn't just, stand up and crinolines and look nice and, pat your children on the back. It really had a lot of problems with it. And the number of twins born, the Winships, the Merriams, the Simons, the Hadley, the Pierces, the Muzzies, and the Smiths all had twins. Laundry day. One day, hanging your clothes out would wear the clothes out if it were a windy March day as much as a month's wearing would do. And which reminds me, sewing sessions. There were 3 petitions pushed forward by Eli Robbins, who was going to die the following year, who was really old and infirm at that point. I shouldn't say old, he was younger than I am. Then Andrew Davidson, but I think George Washington Simons was there getting them to sign the petitions. And then amazingly, a large number of women signed those 3 petitions. So when I did Lexington, what was happening in town, I realized there were professional dressmakers who would go around and help cut out cloth, particularly the heavy broadcloth that didn't need to be hemmed. And at this petition signing, you had 39 women who signed each of the 3 petitions in practically the same order. And so I think they were lined up on the Robbins dining room table. Here, get in line and sign these. And some of them were signed by young Irish women who were in town. The Robbins had 2 Irish girls, quote, and they didn't sign. But Hannah was right there, the daughters were right there, and so forth. And one thing about sewing sessions, you all know about turning skirts, that the waistband has been untouched, but the bottom hem has been dragged along the streets. So you just take the hem, gather it in, and have the waistband, and so it looks at the bottom, and so you have a whole new skirt. How are we doing for time? Okay. Okay, 60% of the women signed that. When you look at the census of Lexington for 1855, they did a state census and go through. They didn't write down the street number, which just about drives one nuts. But anyway, there were so many families, the husband, the wife, the little kids, maybe an elderly aunt, men boarding who would be the farm workers or working in the mill or working at the forge or something like that. And so these women not only had to take care of their own family and own kids, but they also had these workers that they were responsible for feeding and all of this. And there were some families that you could, I traced that an older sister had come when the husband died, and it was not a picturesque daily, it wasn't picture perfect. When you look at old Lexington on these pictures and everything is nice and green and the houses are white and painted, there was a lot of hardship in those days. Okay, I talked about the borders. The sewing session. It was interesting. By 1854, half of the births in Lexington were to parents of Irish descent. And it's amazing the number of American-born women who married Irish men. And I thought that was interesting. There was Patrick Mitchell, who did very well for himself, who married a young woman from New Hampshire, and they had 3 children. And he had an estate equal to Albert Bryan Albert Worthington Bryant, who was the town clerk for 25 years. And so these people really worked themselves up. There was something else. Oh, at this sewing session, it had on the petition the names of the people who signed, of course. And when I looked them up, they varied from the late 70s to maybe 18. And there was one, Mary Capel, who brought her daughter, also Mary. And when I looked them up, Mary was to be married in December, and the petitions were usually presented January or February. So I thought, they've started sewing for the trousseau. And I figured, I could take a chance. Inferred probability. If it is likely to happen, if it's happened steadily in the past, you can infer that it's going to happen again. I like inferred probability better than what critical fabulation. That one historian came up with that, and to me there was a little too much of the fable in there. Okay. Families signed petitions as a family group. There were, 6 or 7 Reeds up off what is now Reed Street and off Bedford Street near 128, near Tophet Swamp. And husbands and wives signed. They brought children, they brought daughters particularly along. The young men were probably busy working. And daughters-in-law were frequent signers of these petitions. And I haven't even mentioned the Mullikans. Nathaniel Mullikan was the one who initiated the petition to free George Latimer, and his family goes through all the petitions. And there was Mary Mullikan, the daughter of the wife who signed, the daughter Mary, the daughter Emily, the daughter Rebecca, and so on. But one of my favorite ones was Ruth Robinson Gamble. Pardon me, not Ruth, Rhoda. Rhoda married Joseph Robinson. Joseph Robinson's father was on the green April 19th with Captain Parker. Okay, so we have Rhoda and her husband, who was the son of a Revolutionary War Captain Parker associate. Rhoda's mother had married Robinson on, wait a minute, I got mixed up. Rhoda married Gamble, and she was the daughter of Betty Hadley and Robinson. And Samuel Hadley had married Betty. They had 3 young children. He, Samuel, his father, and 3 brothers were on the green on April 19th. Samuel was killed, and so Betty, a widow with 3 little kids, 2 years later marries another Revolutionary War soldier from the green, Robinson. And so then her daughter, Rhoda, when the petitions come, she's in her 60s. She wants to stand up for liberty, as all these women did. And so she signs, and not only does she sign, but she gets 5 of her 6 surviving children to sign. And so the theory was, when slavery first became such an issue in the 1830s and 40s, the American Anti-Slavery Standard had a piece. Not for this was bloodshed at Lexington and Concord. And so it tied the whole revolutionary generation back together to support the same causes. And as we leave the women, there's a quote from Middlemarch, the very end of Middlemarch, and I think it refers to the women. For the growing good of the world is partly dependent on unhistoric acts, and that the things not so ill with you and me as they might have been, is half owing to the number who lived faithfully a hidden life and rest in unvisited tombs. And I think of these women of Lexington standing up, signing petitions, using their agency in the only way they could, have made life better for us.
Why when I was saying it's so nice to work with Mary, because we learn, we get context, and then the strategic thinking, putting your mind into the minds of the people that you're researching. And understand Mary's literally looking at petitions where she has a name. That's it, there's a name. And then to go do the research to build the whole community. How many people have had the chance to read any part of Mary's first book about Julia Robbins? If you haven't read that book, I don't have that one tonight. We have the other book here. So you give us $20, we send you home with the book. You will want it, and we don't want to take them back. So keep that in mind. They're back there, and Kamala will help you. So that book, you took a close look at one person. You looked at Julia Robbins, and you shared a bit about her tonight to bring her into our space. I'm curious, and I'm sure we all are, in that close look at one family, did you find yourself putting little Post-it notes with things you wanted to research, and then you picked them up in the second book? How did you get from that close personal look to this very broad cross-community sense of what was going on in Lexington?
I had a little notebook when I was doing Julia, and I would have a separate page for each question. And to tell you the truth, I have no idea where that notebook is. I got involved with petitions because I had gone to a talk at Lexington Library on the Grimke sisters, the Southern women who were a slaveholding family who came north. And Dan Carpenter, who I sort of knew from the neighborhood, was there. And he said, "Oh, Mary, I'm doing a talk tomorrow night on petitions. If you're interested, you should come." Well, this was long before the pandemic. This was about 2015. And the snowbanks, we had snow then, were about this high. And my kind sister said, "I'll drive you. I don't like hunting for parking spaces or driving at night or anything." So I listened to the presentation, and Dan said, "You know, Mary, I've gotten a grant from National Foundation for the Humanities, and I have about 4,500 petitions from Massachusetts for anti-slavery and anti-segregation, and 13 are from Lexington. Do you want to do something with it?" And I said, "Sure." And so 8 years later, I got the book published. But anyway, there is on the website the database for Massachusetts petitions, and I took the ones from Lexington and I downloaded them. I think I downloaded them that night before the site disappeared. I don't like computers and all that fancy stuff. So, and then I started, well, who were these people? So I think I spent a summer just copying out the names. Fortunately, they believed in writing clearly. They didn't go, and so, and then I had to research all of them. And then I had to research, well, what did they sign? What were the petitions about? Who was involved, like this Judge Loring? Who was he? Who was this George Latimer? And I was researching George Latimer, and a happy discovery, it came up that his papers were at Rutgers because George Latimer's son, Lewis, became an inventor and worked with Edison. But they were really housed at the Jamaica Library in Jamaica, New York. And so I wrote to them and said, "Oh, I found his picture, it's terrific. Could I use it?" And they said, "Yes, the cost is." And so it was under $50, so I was able to get that and the runaway ad. But anyway, so that's how I got involved in petitions.
Well, one thing that we've talked about with creating the monument is helping people understand that women in the 1800s who were descended from the men on the green genuinely believed that they were carrying on this Patriot legacy. So you mentioned this, and you started by talking about abolition in particular, that this is this unfinished work, that this is not why the blood was shed. Can you expand a little bit more? Because one thing in the monument approval process, we definitely had some opponents who felt like it's really only about 1775. Like, that's the story. It ends April 19th, the end. And yet your book helps in a very rich way make our point, which is it was one day, but it was an idea that continues to grow and develop now. So as you were doing your research, what are some moments where you felt like, grandchildren, or, this wouldn't have happened but for those men on the green in this relationship? Did you feel that particularly about the granddaughters of men on the green? Or you talked about the naming tradition? Imagine being in class with like George Washington L and George Washington S. Like, that's...
Let's see. I have to gather my thoughts for this one.
I know, I put 3 questions together in one big here.
Well, when I came across Rhoda Robinson Gamble, and she had all her 5 kids signing the petition, I thought, good, and her heritage. And of course, there's Julia, who keeps talking about grandfather. And I can't think anything right now of a eureka moment where it was, oh goodness, this ties it beautifully. But I'm sure as soon as I get home, I will.
I know. Well, we have the Wellingtons. There's a Wellington on the green as well. I know for me, thinking about the slogan, "Something must be done," I will tell that story. On the morning of April 19th, Abigail Harrington wakes up her son Jonathan, saying, "Jonathan, the regulars are out and something must be done." Jonathan is the fifer for Captain Parker. He goes on to be the longest surviving man who was on the green that day, and he tells his story, and he gets to tell it a lot because, again, he's the longest surviving man on the green. He gets to go to all the reunions and anniversaries, and he always starts by talking about his mother waking him up. It turns out she died just a couple years later. You talked about how women often died after childbirth. This saying, "something must be done," then is on the banner that Caroline Wellington sews with her sister Eliza that she takes to the Boston Suffrage Bazaar in 1887. So to me, that's evidence of what you're saying. The women are very aware "something must be done" was on the day of the battle, and they're saying, we too are patriots, no taxation without representation, we should have the right to vote. When you think about Hepzibah and all of these children, or Rhoda and all these children, what do you think this relationship is like between the mothers and the daughters, or the fathers and the mothers, or the grandparents and the grandchildren? Are they telling stories? We won't use fabulation. Let's use inferred facts. Yeah. What do you think? How is the story transmitted?
I think they told each other this story. One of the best-selling books in Lexington was Bancroft's History. And so they were very aware of the past. And I knew that Abigail Harrington was so important, and I spent a day trying to find a descendant of Abigail who had signed petitions and so forth. And really, it just led down a rabbit hole. She married Daniel Harrington, and brother of Jonathan, and then there was a whole line that comes down to Jonas Clark Harrington married Susan Pierce, and then you have some other descendants that I'm sure that I haven't found yet who are related, who signed petitions, so I can link Anna Harrington, but I just didn't pursue that any longer.
I'm going to open it up to questions, so start thinking about your questions, please, or comments. I will just ask one more, which is, as you're doing this work, and you must have a little notebook on your desk, are there topics where you think that's an area I want to further plumb?
Well, I had a whole chapter on Hepzibah. I mean, she just was so hardworking, and all her children, and she was there signing petitions. And so I wrote a chapter on Hepzibah, getting up in the early dawn and getting the crust of bread out of her pocket which was a garment worn under her skirts to feed the babe and so forth, and then going through her children and marriages. Only it didn't fit the structure of the book. Because the book at first was just a sort of a rambling story. And I had taken a writing course with Jane Brox, and she said, Mary, the structure tells the story. And so you have to have, first you have to have the signers, the petition, the background, and then you can go on to the stories about the people. And so there's so much more to do. Gosh, oh.
So let's open it up for people who have questions or comments. And don't be shy. Yes.
Actually going to let you use the microphone.
Mary and I go back to 1968. I first met Mary at Muzzy Junior High when I was a teacher there. And then we went to Clark Middle School, and I got to tell you, Mary told both the teachers and the kids more about Jonas Clark than any of us ever do. She really did. Mary is the same articulate force that you always were.
Thank you.
Now I have a question. In light of what you were saying, did you come across any pandemics? We're just coming off a pandemic. During these years that you researched, did you come across any pandemics?
I didn't come across, quote, a pandemic, but late August, early September were considered dangerous days in colonial days because the swamp, the miasma, whatever, on hot dog days would seem to increase the number of, and there's that, really heart-rending gravestone where something like 6 of the child's children are in the same grave, and they all died within 2 months of each other. And so, in the Robbins family, the younger daughter, Mary, died, and they didn't say why, but there was a cholera epidemic in Boston at that time. So there were references to cholera and to the bad season, but not a pandemic. Yeah, so former students must have questions.
I'll also start with a comment. You talk about, passing the heritage along. So Ruth and I, neither of our parents were born in Lexington. They made the decision to come here. My dad, a physician on his way to Melrose, if you know Dr. Pius, he came through Lexington and decided to stay. But here, Ruth and I end up being the graduation speakers chosen by our classmates for Lexington's bicentennial year, 1975. And having served 21 and a half years in the military, I can tell you that I began my biography when I had my retirement ceremony with the words, born in Lexington, Massachusetts, the birthplace of American liberty. Well, actually, Emerson Hospital's in Concord, but also essential to the story. But I think if we feel that, growing up here, and it's so much of us, that of course the story had to be transmitted. My question is about the petitions process. It's interesting that this is long before women had the right to vote, and yet their names on petitions had value. So could you describe how the petition process worked? It went to the legislature in Boston, and was it the number of names that mattered? They didn't seem to care about gender. Or the more men you had, was it more powerful? How did it work?
Well, it worked that someone would have an idea that there was a wrong, like the Fugitive Slave Act, and they might put an article in the newspaper with the heading of a petition, which people would then cut out, bring home, and paste to another piece of paper. And then they would circulate it around. And women at this time, from the 1830s and 1840s, had been very active in charitable organizations. There was a list this long in the Boston Almanac for the 1840s. There was the Seamen's Charitable Organization, the Young Men's Farm School on Thompson's Island. There were about 20 of them. So women were ready to move into this. And then somebody would think, well, this needs a petition. Maybe Nathaniel Mulligan would be so upset about George Latimer maybe being sent back to slavery that he would write a petition and go around to his neighbors. And when women went around, this was even more challenging because not everybody would agree with them. And it was physically exhausting going farm to farm, door to door, will you sign this petition? But it gave the women agency. And then petitions usually were brought into Boston to the Massachusetts General Court, which is the legislature, the Senate and House of Representatives. And they would usually take these petitions in January or February, which makes me think a lot of the signing was done in cold weather, when you'd be stomping your feet and someone would say, well, I don't know, let me think about this, and so forth. And then on the back of the petitions, there would be sometimes a note written, received by the clerk, and sent to a certain committee, a committee on general welfare. There was one petition on school discrimination that was against black children not being able to attend white schools in Boston, the Roberts case. And that was sent to the Committee on Education. There was a committee on the judiciary. And so Judge Loring's petition would go there. And then it would say, well, it wouldn't say on the petition, but on the Harvard database that Dan Carpenter worked on, it has unpassed legislation, unpassed legislation. So many of them were just unpassed. And then the petitions that went to the federal government, in the federal government, people in Congress, Southern congressmen got so sick of them, they passed the gag resolution that said once a petition comes, it must be immediately tabled. We won't even consider it. So that was in the 1830s. And so not very many were passed. I thought, oh, and they keep going. Oh, and on the petitions, thank you, Ann, there are two columns. One is legal voters, and those, of course, were men who lived in Lexington, who had registered and paid taxes. And then there was a column, others. Sometimes it would say women and others. Sometimes it would just say others. And these would be a businessman who was here passing through who liked the petition but wasn't a legal voter. He'd be shunted aside with the women. And then when I was researching the women, particularly at the one I think was that signed at a sewing bee, there were out-of-towners not found anywhere in Lexington records, but with a name that matched a Lexington name. And so it's fascinating. It could go on forever.
Hi, Marion. Good to see you again. My name's George McCormick, a colleague of Mary's for many, many years as a teacher, like with Warren. And my wife, Loretta, was also a teacher and a colleague of Mary. And I still remember the year that you were voted Teacher of the Year, which didn't surprise any of us. But my question to you is along the lines that a few people have talked about with petitions, because I don't think we've gone very far to see people standing outside of supermarkets asking for your signature. And of course, it's much different today because they are asking, well, are you a resident of, because if the petition's about a particular town, you got to live in that town. And when you were mentioning children, they were signing? I mean, was there an age limitation? I hear you saying a resident, that makes sense, but what limitations, if any, and were there challenges when these petitions arrived about being able to read the name or not read the name?
Maybe I misspoke about children. The youngest signer I found was, I think, 16, and she was one of the Reeds. And there also was a young Wellington who signed. But I think it was Caroline Wellington who didn't sign some of the first petitions, and I think the family might have said, you aren't old enough, but when she was in her later teens. but there were a lot of young people who signed who were in their early 20s. And I think one of the petitions was signed at a party. It was mostly all young people, single girls and bachelors. And so I thought, and it was at a holiday season. So I thought, I'll just assume. I'll just infer.
Didn't you have one person who signed a petition when she was in her teens or really young, and then signed another petition 30 or 40 years later? Do you remember who that was?
Yes, I can't remember their name.
It's two of us.
But anyway.
Mary, does it make you wonder about how many petitions may have been started but never submitted? Do you feel like this is all the petitions that happened in Lexington, or what do you think?
Oh, well, there were 13, and the total number of signers came out to be, there were 951 signers, the 951 signatures. Of those, 536 were legal, 342 were women, but the signatures aren't the same as signers. For example, some people like Andrew Wellington signed all 13 petitions. So the 951 signatures is beyond. And what was the second part of the question?
I already forgot my own question because I had a new question. I'm sorry. I think one of the things we're not even digging in, because you'll read the book and then you'll have much more of the story, but it should be said. You have given us this really deep way to look into two of these very critical issues in the 1800s, abolition and slavery, and then women's suffrage. And what's so interesting is you can easily see why these were just dismissed. It's just names on a piece of paper. It takes a lot of work to make the names come to life the way you've done. Like 8 years seems like you were probably not sleeping a lot to get this much done. During that time, it's a lot of research. When we look at Lexington in the mid-1800s, there had been more black people here, enslaved and free black people in the 1700s, and more people, if they were able to, moved further west, probably to communities where there was a better sense of community. What do you make, and again, I don't want you to get too deep into it because let people read the book, but a little bit, because it should be talked about, is what do you make of a predominantly white community spending this energy on petitions that are about the plight of black people?
Well, I think people then were very kind. I mean, all the charitable societies that were going on. One of the big petitions was put out by Reverend Samuel May, who was Louisa May Alcott's uncle, and it was better treatment of released prisoners, and they really seemed to have a heart. And I was really moved by that. But you mentioned abolition and then women's suffrage. Women got involved in abolition because they were so horrified at the stories. And Julia would go into Boston with her cousin, George Washington Simons, and listen to George Thompson, the English abolitionists, or the Crafts, who were a couple that escaped, William Box Brown, who mailed himself to freedom. And then when the 15th Amendment came and it said black men will vote and women weren't, then they redoubled their efforts. And Julia, by that time, had married a Concord farmer, and she got involved in municipal suffrage. In 1879, the Massachusetts legislature passed school suffrage. Women who were so good with kids and around the house and neatening things up could vote for school committee. And then a lot of women did. And then they said, why aren't we voting for more? And they were pushing for municipal suffrage. If we can't vote for president, as they did in some Western states, at least we can vote for our local. But there was such a hue and cry against it because it was felt that the Republican women would be against the Irish Catholic Democrats who had all these taverns, and they were afraid of liquor licenses being rejected and all of this. And so women didn't get municipal suffrage in Massachusetts until 1920, when the 19th Amendment was passed. And just as an aside, some of you may have met my mom, and I had an opportunity to check out her registration. The 19th Amendment was passed on Wednesday, August 18th, and on Friday, August 20th, Mary A. Keenan was registering to vote. So,
I'm checking our time with Helen. How are we doing? We're good. Okay. That is an important insight into also how you're thinking about how historic women were transmitting stories to their daughters and their children, their sons and daughters, because you have the Wellington men also signing the petition for women's suffrage.
right.
Right. So we do see that there are people, regardless of gender. It does make it kind of a miracle that women ever won the right to vote, because this is what they had to do. It was a very narrow place to get through. Do you draw any insight from how they actually achieved it to lessons that can be used today?
I think they watched their mothers and their sisters and all the trouble that they went through and how they wanted that desperately. Andrew Wellington, the one who signed all 13 petitions, represented Lexington at the October 1850 First National Women's Suffrage Convention in Worcester. And they have the members list, and his name is right there, Andrew Wellington.
Epsiba did a good job, right?
Yes.
She really did. Yes. If you picked up a book or still would like to, Mary will sign your book, right?
Right.
Yes, she will do that. Is there any other burning question that people have? Because we want to leave a little time for people to chat with Mary, who came out for the evening. Please join me in triple thanking Mary for writing the book and then for coming to speak with us.
Oh,
Thank you, Mary.
thank you. This is so much fun. It's like old home week.
And then I promise I will give you a quick update on the monument, as I always do in a speaker series event. The monument by Meredith Bergman includes more than 22 women and girls, and Mary's research was critical. Julia Robbins is one of the women in the monument, and when you see Julia, Meredith has portrayed her standing with her niece, Ellen Adelia Stone, at her side. It's a lovely pairing, and it's thinking about, again, this transmission of information across family in different relationships, to not just mother and daughter, but also aunt or aunt, if you're from here and I'm not, and niece. So that is lovely. And then Ellen Adelia Stone goes on to essentially donate the Stone Building to Lexington. And the Lexington Lyceum advocates are working to preserve that building, so we always encourage people to check them out. And then also Caroline Wellington is one of the central figures, so when you stand at the center of this monument, you can hold hands with Caroline, and she is carrying the Something Must Be Done banner in the monument. And then we have Abigail Harrington, not in Mary's book, but I mentioned her on the morning of the battle, and we see her in the monument holding her daughter, waking up her son, Jonathan. So you can learn more about the monument at LexSeeHer.com, and it will be unveiled May 15th. The tickets are just about gone. I mean, I don't know what we're going to do about that. But dedication day will be Saturday, May 18th, and we hope tons of people will come out to our first look events. As Helen said, they will run for a full year, so everyone can come enjoy their first look, whenever that may be for you. Thank you all so much for coming. Thank you especially to Helen, who has made all of our programs so smoothly run, and to Cary, the foundation that makes these events possible. Thank you all.
Thank you, Jessie. Thank you, Mary.